Liz Truss's credibility is in tatters. Her Chancellor's mini-budget crashed the pound and hiked interest rates, and pretty much everyone in the country thinks she's useless. So a 30-minute live TV interview was always going to be difficult. These were the most cringe-inducing parts.
I do want to say to people, I understand their worries about what has happened this week, and I do stand by the package we announced, and I stand by the fact that we announced it quickly because we had to act. But I do accept we should have laid the ground better. I do accept that.
You accept you should have laid the ground better.
I have learnt from that. I have learnt from that, and I will make sure that in future we do a better job of laying the ground.
Laying the ground, fine. You've acknowledged what there was a problem with communications. You should have explained things better. But I want to show our audience and you what actually happened, because this is not just a global problem. It's not arguably just a problem of communications. It's a problem of the consequence of the decision that you made. If we look at this graph, and you can look at it over there, Prime Minister, you can see what happened to the cost of government borrowing. On the day that you made that announcement, it spiked. And it didn't just spike, it's predicted to stay high for long. Now, the reason that matters is when it costs the government more to borrow, everything costs more. Everybody feels the increase in interest rates, whether that's on government, on mortgages, on people's rents. This is a direct consequence of the decisions you made last week. And interest rate increases are going to mean pressure on people's mortgages and less money for public services.
We have been in a very long period of low interest rates. And the fact is that due to the war in Ukraine perpetrated by Russia, interest rates are rising around the world. And we've seen that in the United States, and we've seen that in Europe. So I don't accept, Laura, I don't accept that part of your argument. Now, on the subject of government borrowing, I think it is right.
Forgive me, Liz Truss, we'll come to that in a second. But look, on that graph, that is a spike in the cost of borrowing for the government, which feeds through to everybody else as a direct result of the decisions that you announced on September the 23rd. This is not about what was going on in the war in Ukraine already. We know that that's a huge challenge. But look at the direct result on that day. And the chief economist at the Bank of England,
that is not the same as interest rates, though, Laura. But I think the audience should be clear that that is not the same as interest rates, which are rightly set by the Independent Bank of England.
That was Liz Truss trying to blame the Bank of England for people's interest rates going up. Laura Kuenssberg was completely right in that situation. Now, the increase in interest the government pays on bonds feeds directly into mortgage costs. That's what Liz Truss wanted to deny. And those costs, those mortgage costs, went up immediately after Truss and Kwarteng's mini budget. It wasn't the Bank of England. Everyone can see that, or however fluent you are in economics. It also wasn't Vladimir Putin. You don't need to know much about that conflict to realize the timing didn't match up. Now we can go from dishonesty to delusion.
But I'm absolutely committed to delivering great public services for people. That is very, very important.
But that's not the same as saying that you'll make sure departments have enough money to combat inflation. That's not the same as saying you're not going to cut public spending.
Well, I believe in outcomes rather than inputs. I believe in what people see and what people feel. So, for example, the Health Secretary has committed that people will be able to see their GP within 2 weeks. And that's what we're focused on. We're focused on how does it feel for a patient? You know, how does it feel for me as a woman walking down the street? Do I feel safe at night? Those are the things I'm thinking about as Prime Minister. And that's what we're focused on, delivering better public services. And I think quite often, frankly, the debate focuses too much on the input and not enough on how it actually feels for people in Britain. And they want public services that are focused on, delivering for them.
I believe in outcomes, not inputs. And what does that mean? You don't believe in either outcomes or inputs. We obviously all care about outcomes. That means the quality of care we get in the NHS or how safe we feel on the street. But the job of government isn't just to say, we want good things. I'm the Prime Minister and I say that the NHS is going to be good. No, you have to tell us how you're going to get it. That's when the inputs matter, right? And that involves funding it properly. Liz Truss is doing precisely the opposite. She's saying, oh yeah, the inputs is the funding. I'm cutting the inputs, but I'm still going to get good outputs. Why? Because I say so. It's fantasy. It's fantasy land she's living in. And also what she's essentially asking the audience to do is trust me. I'm not going to show you how the sausage is made. I'm not going to show you how I'm going to dramatically improve services in the NHS. You just got to believe me. Now, one thing we are not in the mood to do at the moment, Liz, is believe you. Right. So if you're going to say that services are going to improve, you better show us how, because we are not, your currency and trust is not very high at the moment. So this just sounds like complete nonsense. Also, it's worth saying, I saw people saying today that Liz Truss is saying you'll be able to see your GP within 2 weeks. I think under New Labour, the target was 2 days. The 2 weeks to see a GP is not particularly impressive. And that's her sort of reaching for the stars. I'm not going to show you how I'm going to do it. I'm just going to set this very, very dramatic target, which is to see your doctor in 2 weeks. Like, what? Anyway, let's move on to another clip. And this is what many people considered to be Kuenssberg's killer line.
How many people voted for your plan?
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
Well, you've set out a significant change of direction from the Conservative government that you were being part of for many, many years. But how many people voted for you to do that?
Well, people in 2019 who voted Conservative voted for a successful country where we are levelling up all parts of the country and where we're driving growth, enterprise and opportunity. Now, any government has to deal with the circumstances it faces. And we face this situation of, which was unforeseen, huge energy costs, rising inflation due to the war in Ukraine and the aftermath of COVID.
But you know
we
very
are
well, Prime Minister, that there are a small
delivering.
number of people in the Conservative Party, tens of thousands, rather than the whole country, voted for you in the leadership contest, perfectly legitimately. But do you fear that you have put the country on a path that it didn't ask for, because you believe very strongly that it will lead to growth? Finally, what happens if it doesn't work?
Well, what people voted for in 2019, when they voted for Conservative, sometimes for the first time in many years, is they voted for a different future. They voted for investment into their towns and cities. They voted for higher wages. They voted for economic growth. And that is what our plan will deliver.
I'm sorry, what do you mean? That was a Liz Truss silence there. It was a good question, I thought, actually, from Laura Kuenssberg, because obviously, constitutionally it is perfectly correct that Liz Truss was elected via the rules of the Conservative Party, and that means she is, the legitimate Prime Minister, whatever. That's how the rules do work. But if you are going to get into the job like that, then should you really be doing something as radical as what she is doing? And also, I think this is really important when it comes to how the markets have been behaving. We've been saying on this show sort of over and over again that, if there were a left-wing government and the markets took a disliking to their budget, then we wouldn't say, oh, well, that's the reason to completely rewrite the budget. No, it's probably fine to piss off the market sometimes. If you're doing it to make the rich richer, it's a bit bizarre. It seems a bit self-defeating if that's what you're trying to do. But I've got no problem with that. But if you are going to do that, if you were going to sort of risk people's pensions, you better have a mandate to do it. Right, because if you're having that, it doesn't even make sense to say they're having a fight with the markets, because they're trying to make rich people richer. But sort of in theory, if you were going to do risky things, you should have a democratic mandate, and she does not have that. Perhaps more damaging, though, than anything Laura Kuenssberg said was how Michael Gove responded to the interview.
Michael Gove, what did you make of Liz Truss? Some really interesting nuggets in there.
There certainly were, and I thought it was right for the Prime Minister to acknowledge that the events of Friday, that fiscal event, need to be revisited. There needs to be a recognition of mistakes, but I think that it's still the case that on the basis of what the Prime Minister said, and she was very clear and authoritative, but it is still the case, I think, that there is an inadequate realisation at the top of government of the scale of change required. So yes, the energy package was the most important thing in the fiscal event, but broadly 35% of the additional money that we're borrowing is not to cut energy costs, it is for unfunded tax cuts.
And you sound concerned about that.
Profoundly.
You're profoundly concerned.
Yes, because there are two things that are problematic, two major things that were problematic with the fiscal event. The first is the sheer risk of using borrowed money to fund tax cuts. That is not Conservative. And then the second thing is the decision to cut the 45p rate, and indeed at the same time to change the law which governs how bankers are paid in the City of London. Ultimately, at a time when people are suffering, and you're quite right to point out the concerns that people have, not just over mortgages, but over benefits, when you have additional billions of pounds in play, to have as your principal decision the headline tax move, cutting tax for the wealthiest, that is a display of the wrong values.
Aaron, what did you make of Laura Kuenssberg versus Liz Truss?
I thought she was doing okay, actually, until that final question where she just looked utterly ridiculous. And even your impression, Michael, I don't think quite did it justice. You know, the hand gesture, it was so Partridge-esque. It was remarkable. And I was like, oh my God, that's all you need for the YouTube shorts, the Instagram reels, for TikTok, for the 6 o'clock news. That's all you need. The rest of the interview doesn't matter anymore. But she sounded confident. She didn't sound like a broken politician, right? Which actually I was a bit surprised at, given the week she just had. And I would push back a little bit, Michael, on that thing about inputs and outputs. I do think that politicians should focus on outcomes. If you're a business, you don't say, we're a really successful business. We've just purchased a new HQ. We've just hired 10,000 new staff. We're spending this much on training. We're doing this. We're doing that. Okay, well, what's happened to your profit margins? Oh, well, we don't need to talk about that because actually we judge success by all the inputs. I don't think anybody says that. And actually, really successful businesses or any successful organization would say, actually, we've achieved this while being very sort of austere and clever on the inputs. You know, businesses don't say, oh, we've hired more people, ergo we're more successful. So I don't quite agree with you there. And I think politicians should focus on outcomes. I do want politicians to solve problems. I would love a government to say, yeah, we're going to bring back seeing a GP within 48 hours, within 18 months. We don't know how we're going to do it yet, but we're going to do it. Come back to us, in 2 years' time at an election and judge us on that thing we're going to focus on. I like that personally. So I'll push back a little bit on that. What I would say, Michael, is 24 million people in the last general election in 2019 voted for either Jeremy Corbyn, a radical social democrat, or for Boris Johnson, who was offering levelling up one nation conservatism. 24 million people, right? The vast majority of the electorate, obviously. And what we're getting instead now is austerity, absolutely on a par with what we got with George Osborne after 2010. You know, the budget that the fiscal overview he offered in 2010 when they came into government, I think it was something like £80 billion worth of cuts over 4 years. And it was just over 80 billion. And what now is being touted is like 18.5 billion. So this is absolutely on a par with what George Osborne was saying. We're looking at Osbornian Cameronite austerity, which everybody had said was over. Austerity is over, is never coming back. We have 24 million people in a general election voting for nothing to do with austerity, either as levelling up or radical social democracy and public ownership, and yet we've got something completely different. And so I do think it is absolutely unacceptable that they're embarking on this path. It's unacceptable. I often when people say, oh, well, the members chose the prime minister. Well, yeah, we have a party system. That's how our democracy works in this country. We need PR. We need more political parties and more political parties with more members to give it more legitimacy. Sure, but that's just the system and that's how it works. But I think part of that bargain is when you come in like Liz Truss has, or like Gordon Brown did, or like Theresa May did, or Boris Johnson, when you haven't won that mandate in an election, it's absolutely unacceptable to deviate from the promises made by your predecessor to this extent. On the tax cuts, I disagree with Gove a bit in so much as even a Keynesian, even a left-wing economist would say, in a recession, which is what we're heading into, you shouldn't increase taxes. I don't agree with that necessarily. I think corporation tax should go up. Labour, for instance, had that position. You remember when Rishi Sunak was saying they were going to increase corporation tax, and initially Labour said, well, no, you shouldn't do that. That is a legitimate Keynesian position. So the idea that you shouldn't have taxes not going up, he was saying unfunded tax cuts. Well, it's not technically a tax cut because the taxes were, that was going forward. They were going to put corporation tax from 19% to like what, 24, 25%, but it hadn't happened yet. And so you're basically saying that policy, which is, 6 months, a year ahead of us, I think that would have come in from April next year, the beginning of the financial year, that's now not going to happen. So that's not an uncosted tax cut. That's saying we're going into a recession, we probably shouldn't increase taxes. I don't personally agree with that. But I think it's important, at least that's a serious policy. I think it probably is important to disaggregate, for instance, freezing corporation tax, maybe even reducing personal basic rate of tax to 19p. I think it's probably important to disaggregate those, which are at least moderately serious policies in the context of recession. You can talk about them seriously. And then getting rid of the top rate of tax, which was just insane, not just politically, which it was, but also economically, because it barely raises any money and there's absolutely no reason to do it at all. But particularly when you're looking at a downturn. In a downturn, you want to use public finances to stimulate demand. Where's most demand coming from? Your average blue collar worker, person earning the median wage, 30 grand a year, not from somebody on megabucks on 200 grand a year.
I want to push back on a couple of those things. I suppose on the inputs outputs issue, I see what you're saying. If you're in a business meeting, if you are speaking to your shareholders and you're giving them a review of the past 2 or 5 years, you're not going to say, "Oh, I hired this many people, I did this many internal reforms." You're going to say, "Profits are this high, so you should be happy with me." But that's when you're talking about the past. If you're talking about the future, you kind of got to show us how you're getting there, and especially if your actions look like they're going to take you in the opposite direction. So if you're saying, look, I'm going to cut these services, but don't worry about that. So I'm going to cut the funding for these services, but don't worry about that because all I care about is outcomes. Then what are we supposed to do? Just believe her? Because I feel like she probably does owe it to us to tell us a little bit about the mechanism of how she's going to get there, especially if her actions look like they're going in the opposite direction. I think the same would apply in a business.
Yes, but as a principle, Michael, I want politicians to be judged on outcomes. I don't want somebody saying he's a radical social democrat. They just spent an extra £10 billion on the NHS. Or where's it all going into? Private healthcare providers and PFI projects. I'd prefer the 5 billion done in a more, in a way that's more congruent with public ownership. So it just doesn't sit well with me. Yes, of course, any business, Michael, if you're going to shareholders and you're saying, I want to be judged on profit, that's what they say. I want to be judged on outcomes. They don't say, shareholders, we've had a wonderful year. We hired 50,000 new people. They don't say that. So I agree with you. By the way, Liz Truss is awful and she's not going to achieve the outcomes. I'm sure we agree on that, Michael. But as a principle, I think it is strange to judge people on the inputs. And by the way, in this country, actually, we could do a damn sight better than we do without spending any money. As you gradually, we could move funding away, for instance, from housing benefit, which is a landlord subsidy, towards building social housing. Actually, that's a misallocation of funds. You do it gradually, of course, but you wouldn't need to spend extraordinary amounts of money to actually achieve quite a lot. Or with regards to procurement, rolling out the Preston model across the whole country, that wouldn't really cost anything in terms of central government funding. So I would rather focus, yes, on the outputs rather than the inputs.
I think if you've got shareholders and you've got a new boss who it's very difficult to remove, and they're doing something which looks like it's gonna radically lower profits or put you in debt, then they're not just going to accept, "Oh, I believe in outputs." But anyway, this is slightly semantic. I want to now briefly just go on to the tax cuts thing. So I suppose you're saying it's not completely unreasonable just to cut taxes if you're going into a recession. I suppose what that ignores is that this isn't a recession that's necessarily because of a lack of demand. It's a recession because of increased prices. And one way to respond to increased prices is to share the load, right? So if you've got a massive increase in energy costs, then the issue isn't so much that we're going into a recession because of reduced demand. It's that we're going into a recession because of these increased costs and we need to share the load. So you share the load. If what you've got is high inflation and lots of poverty, then you probably do need to have a solidarity tax on rich people so that you can help poor people deal with these increased costs without sending inflation out of control. So that's why I'd say, I kind of agree with Michael Gove on this one.
Oh, no, I do. Michael, look, I want a much higher rate of corporation tax. Also, corporation tax has this wonderful effect of incentivizing investment because, of course, that means, you pay less towards tax because you have this disincentive to accumulate all these profits, and so you put more in investing in the business. It has a very important ancillary effect. So I'm not suggesting for a minute, we shouldn't put up corporation tax. What I'm saying is, for an orthodox centre-right government which wants to be popular and wants to look economically credible, I could see George Osborne doing that. I could see Ken Clarke saying that. I could see Rishi Sunak saying that, although he's done something very different. I actually think Rishi Sunak was all over the place too as well, Michael, because you had, for a year, the Tories talking about, we're going to put up national insurance. Then actually, for pretty much everyone under 55 grand a year, then national insurance went down because thresholds change. Meanwhile, Joe Public thinks that actually they've gone up. A complete catastrophe. And that precedes Truss. Very important to say, the messaging on tax and who gets what. But all I'm saying is, Michael, I think this policy on the top rate of tax is a little bit different to those other ones, because you could see how a centre-right mainstream politician in a crisis would perhaps pursue those policies. And look, they could have, for instance, done what they've done on energy intervention. They could have reduced the the basic rate of tax by 1p. They could have just done those two measures, right? And that would have been really popular. And they could have said, this is a conservative budget. We're looking out for the working person. The VAT changes too, maybe, right? But it's the change, particularly with corporation tax, although I still think that's a much more legitimate policy than the top rate of tax. With corporation tax and the top rate of tax, you just think you couldn't say no to the IEA, could you? You just couldn't say no to them. And I think that's such an important thing in politics when you're on the left as well, right? If you're a left-wing political leader, the ability to say no to your own base and they're demanding something. Because look, ultimately, you need other people's votes as well. And I find it remarkable that the Conservative Party, this election-winning machine, the most successful political entity in European history, in many ways. I mean, I'm not going to include, the Icelandic Nationalist Party or whatever, been in power basically constantly since 1930. Of all the major political parties on this continent, the British Conservative Party is the most successful. And I find it incredible that they allowed themselves to have their defining political crowning moment, both Truss and Kwarteng, to be determined by the likes of the IEA and the Taxpayers Alliance. I find it remarkable. It's almost as if, the electorate was just 30 bespectacled, suited, right-wing policy wonks, rather than actually people who have to pay bills and, and sometimes they go to the ATM and there's no money in there or they're overdrawn. I find it remarkable. I really do. I wonder, are there any sort of voices in the Truss cabinet, conciliary, advisors who at least can inject a little bit of wisdom into these discussions, even from their response today from Kwarteng, from Truss? I don't think so. I don't think so. And so to conclude, well, people say, well, it's 2 years out from a general election. This is the bottom for the Tories. Okay, Labour in some polls are 25 ahead, 30 ahead, 33 ahead, but the Tories can make it back. Well, if your judgment is so poor that you find yourself 33 points behind after less than a month in the top job, what's not to say it can't get worse? I mean, you've patently got quite poor political judgment.